Hi there, I'm Garnet Hertz, and I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. One thing, just to start off, that I think is important to keep in mind in this paper is that it was written in 2012. It has a lot of references to the Occupy movement, and that's one thing to keep in mind when reading this as a general kind of context. So the paper starts out with, the main argument is that decolonialization is not a metaphor, and that it has real impact into how educational structures and systems and infrastructures are designed and run. Now, so in terms, and I'll just pull through, I'll just read out a few quotes from here as we walk through it. The main, and actually I should say, and I'm going to do this in one take, so this may be kind of rough, but I should also say that part of the initial thrust of this article is actually to look out for fake decolonialization, where there's a token kind of effort to decolonialize an institution, but it actually just distracts from doing the real work required. So, how settler colonialism has shaped schooling and educational research. There are two distinct and overlapping tasks. The first is concerned with how the invisibilized dynamics of settler colonialism mark the organization, governance, curricula, and assessments of compulsory learning, and concerned with how settler perspectives and worldviews get to count as knowledge and research. So this starts out with the task of trying to establish decolonialization as a real infrastructural and systematic problem, and not just a token bunch of words. Okay, so that's the start of it. Now, the article continues with arguing that decolonialization is not a synonym. It's very clear in this, and very consistent in going through and hammering at the idea that this is not a metaphor or a thing. It's actually relates to how land is allocated, how policies are implemented, and it's not just a token kind of gesture. So some of my notes here. Part of the danger that the article outlines of fake discourse is that it really gets in the way of meaningful alliances. It primarily, and this is the danger of decolonialization, is that it has the ability to just basically be a scapegoat for settlers to take on and to basically just feel better about themselves. Now, to start out with, the authors lay out a couple of good terms that I think are useful. One is called external colonialism. The other is internal colonialism. In external colonialism, all things native become recast as natural resources. Bodies and earth for war, bodies for earth for chattel. Okay, so external colonialism in this paper refers to exogenous or exploitation or colonialization, rather in the traditional sense of colonialization in the Columbus kind of sense. Columbus going to Hispaniola, enslaving the Taino people and this kind of thing is external colonialism. Now, internal colonialism is more the management type of work done to manage people, land, flora, and fauna within domestic borders. So it's kind of internal. And let's keep reading here. And it's particularized modes of control: prisons, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling, policing. Okay, so this is more the systemic racism. to take a term from Black Lives Matter in 2020. This is much more the systemic racism component of it. Now, in this way, the paper goes beyond kind of some discourse around decolonialization and makes the claim that land is what was most valuable, contested, and required for colonialism, and goes further to propose that any act to decolonialize things needs land reclamation as a necessary component. We'll get into that later, but land plays a really important part in this paper, and it outlines how settlers really require our land, and the interesting component about settling is that it really did what, in a lot of ways, was and the paper refers to it as an epistemic shift. That's a change in kind of worldview or thinking. Now, in other words, they basically created this idea of property and land as property, and essentially completely undermined the worldview, or indigenous kind of worldview and relations, by doing that. And that is actually really quite important. The idea of property, and that land can be owned by a person. And the paper continues, and this section is actually quite useful. Pages 6 and 7 of the paper. It makes a distinction between settlers and immigrants. And this, I thought, was actually quite clever and quite nicely written. Settlers become the law. Okay? Settlers take dominion over the place that they settle. Settlers essentially become the god or the ruler or the authority, okay? And this is very different than immigrants. Settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants have a very different, for example, white people were not immigrants when they came to North America. They were settlers. They took their worldview and they forced it on the existing people. Immigrants are the other way around, where immigrants have the indigenous world, or indigenous with a lowercase I, worldview forced on them. Okay, so it's a very different power dynamic, and I thought that was quite a nice part of the paper. How there's a distinction between the settler and the immigrant. A simple point, but actually really nicely argued. So, the idea with a colony is that, in a lot of ways, it's really like an empire that needs land and that needs resources. Okay, so by shifting the epistemic kind of world knowledge of property, you get the land, you get the property, you get the people, and that's kind of at the basis of a lot of colonial and decolonial thought. Decolonialization in a settler context is fraught because empire, settlement, and internal colony have no spatial separation. Decolonialization as a metaphor allows people to equivocate these contradictory decolonial desires because it turns decolonialization into an empty signifier to be filled by any track towards liberation. Okay? Decolonialization never takes place unnoticed by Fanon. Fanon is very, I would probably say, one of the most prominent decolonial critical theorists, at least historically. Settler colonialism and its decolonialization implicates and unsettles everyone. Okay, because colonialization requires land, property, resources, people. when you decolonialize stuff, you really pull the carpet out, and it gets messy, and it will get nasty, is basically what is said here on page 7. So then to continue on, the authors go into different reasons why different kind of forms of fake decolonialization, or efforts to acknowledge indigenous culture or life, but in ways that are dismissive and in the end harmful. Now, the authors talk about the idea of playing Indian as one of these roles, and by the way, these are roles that should be avoided, if that wasn't obvious. And this is something where the idea of playing Indian, using these type of picking up cultural things, playing with indigenous forms of culture. The idea here that the authors present is that this is kind of a form of desire and repulsion. Okay, and this is kind of an attraction and repulsion. I like the word frisson to describe that. And this is primarily driven by a desire to get rid of indigenous culture, and also to be made innocent and to kind of return back to nature. And I'm assuming if you're familiar with the history of Western art and how indigenous culture has been appropriated there, I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with those kind of themes. Now, another thing is another kind of like disgenuine or ungenuine kind of indigenization is described as settler nativism. Now, this is the idea of having a indigenous grandmother, well known by politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Nancy Reagan and other American. And this is an American paper, and so a lot of these examples are American. And it talks about how, and there's an author here, Vinnie Deloria Jr., calls it the Indian grandmother complex. And it's primarily an non-indigenous kind of thing to move into a place of being more innocent and less kind of guilty of the damages of colonialization or the being guilty. And instead, it's used to deflect settler identity while continuing to enjoy settler privilege and occupying stolen land. Okay? And this, in many ways, this kind of tracking of indigenous ancestry, in some ways, reinforces the idea of mythical belief in indigenous blood and culture and many other things. And the authors kind of outline that. And one important thing here to remember is that ancestry is different from tribal membership. And there are many points in here. I should say that this article is very thick, and it goes through and it really whales through a lot of content. To be honest, it does it in kind of a roundabout way, and I honestly wish that it would be about half the length. But it has a lot of actually good information in it if you have the patience to sit through it and read it. Okay. There's also this idea of a settler fantasy of becoming adopted into an indigenous family that the authors outline. Okay, and to just reinforce that, these are not good things. I'm going to skip over some of this because, quite frankly, I don't want a 45-minute video. This is another nice takeaway. The triad of the settler, native, slave. Settler, native, and slave kind of coming together to form kind of a system. and there is some mention of Aleutian people interned during World War II. And that also goes for Japanese Canadians interned in Canada. Now, the idea here, and why I have this drawing of what is supposed to be Bootsy Collins, is they basically make a disagreement with George Clinton and Funkadelic that if you free your mind, your ass will follow. And obviously this is like fitting in a funny pop culture reference into a very thick academic paper. So, haha, good score on that one. But the point is basically that if you freeing your mind isn't enough. You need to free your land. Okay, that is the argument of this paper. Yeah, toward the middle of it. Until stolen land is relinquished, critical consciousness does not translate into action that disrupts settler colonialism. Okay, now, this is actually a nice takeaway. So repatriation of land is central here in the middle of the paper. And I'm just going to read this section. We deliberately extend Cicera's words above to assert what decolonialization is not. It is not converting indigenous politics to a Western doctrine of liberation. It is not a philanthropic process of helping the at-risk alleviating suffering. It is not a generic term for struggle against oppressive conditions and outcomes. The broad umbrella of social justice may have room underneath for all of these efforts. By contrast, decolonialization specifically requires a repatriation of indigenous land and life. Now, the lack of this paper is that it doesn't really outline that. It doesn't really go to the step of really explaining how that's done. And to be honest with you, I think many people at Emily Carr, at least, would agree with that and are sort of already on, I would assume, are for the most part, all on board with that. The problem with this paper is that how to repatriate indigenous land and life, how do you repatriate life, is a really complicated question. And it leaves a lot up to interpretation. So to continue, we don't intend to discourage those who have dedicated careers and lives to teaching themselves and others to be critically conscious of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, xenophobia, and settler colonialism. We are asking them or you to consider how the pursuit of critical consciousness, the pursuit of social justice through critical enlightenment, can also be settler moves to innocence, diversions, distractions, which relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility to conceal the need to give up land or power or privilege. And to be honest with you, this is the type of shit that is for the most part, you see a lot of this stuff where it is read this paper and nobody shows up to the meeting, or go do this and work on that, and think about these things. But in terms of I think what their main point is that it doesn't fucking matter in terms of your critical awareness. What matters is actually it doesn't matter because you're primarily doing that to just alleviate your sense of guilt. What you actually need to do is give up your land or power or privilege. Okay? So your critical theory and all that sort of shit, and actually I'd argue this paper too, doesn't really make a shit of difference until you give up your privilege and work to do that. So we can read all the papers about Fanon, Mbembe, whoever, It doesn't fucking matter until something is done. Now, to continue with this, there's also there's a discussion that that indigenous populations are damaged because of two things. Because they are at risk, they are seen as at-risk people, and they're also perceived as asterisk people. Now I'll explain this. At-risk people are groups that the general population thinks are very much at risk of dropping out of school, having educational problems, having developmental problems, even if that's not necessarily the case. Okay, Indigenous people, in some circumstances, there are a lot of issues, and those need to be looked at and dealt with. On the other hand, you can't look at an entire Indigenous population and say that they're all at risk. Because what ends up happening is you end up having a very authoritarian kind of control over their educational system, over their culture, and the services promised at the inception of these mandates do little to make schools attended by Indigenous youth better at providing them a compelling, relevant, inspiring, and meaningful education. So in other words, when you start looking at Indigenous people as at risk, you put them basically on like minimal educational, you're starting out not giving them an enriched environment to begin with, and you're actually doing more harm to them by not just treating them as if they were going to a normal school. Okay. Now, what is meant in this paper by asterisked is that Indigenous populations in many kind of statistical situations come across as marginal. Okay, they are represented by an asterisk in large and crucial data sets. They are a small percentage. Okay, and this is actually a big problem. When you combine the at risk with the small population, you end up with a lot of really destructive policies. Okay, so from a decolonializing perspective, the asterisk is a body count that does not account for Indigenous politics, educational concerns, and epistemologies. Urban land, indeed all land, is native land. The vast majority of native youth in North America live in urban settings. Anyhow, these kids aren't many times in cities. Any decolonialization urban education endeavor must address the foundations of urban land pedagogy and Indigenous politics vis-a-vis the colonial settler state. Okay, now to continue. Now I am going to make a 30-minute video, even if I'm trying to rush through this, because this is a kind of a beast of a paper. It's good, but it is long-winded and has many points. So basically, decolonialization is essentially going from this to there, okay, instead of the other way around. That's the basic claim of the paper. Settler colonialization can be visually understood as the unbroken pace of invasion. Decolonialization as a process would repatriate land to Indigenous peoples, reversing the timeline of these images. Okay, so they're proposing that this needs to go backwards and that land is really core to part of this. They don't really go into a lot of detail about that, but that's their main claim. Decolonialization eliminates settler property rights and settler sovereignty. I'll read that again, because this and take in mind that this is two authors' perspective. Decolonialization eliminates settler property rights and settler sovereignty. It requires the abolition of land as property and upholds the sovereignty of nature and native land and people. Okay. This maybe is kind of a major takeaway. I mean, they're not timid with this, and it is really quite inspiring. But it would completely overhaul all of society in a massive way if the abolition of land as property would actually take place. So this is a very kind of aspiring type of article. It discusses how a country like Haiti has been thrown into debt because of payments needed to make to slave owners, not the enslaved people. It's actually a fascinating history the history of Haiti is in terms, I mean, it's essentially the only kind of slave state that successfully revolted and started up a country, but they were thrown into debt because the slave owner, the country was eternally thrown into debt because of paying off the slave owners, not the enslaved people. Okay, now the article, so it goes into a bit about Haiti, then it goes into present reading lists, okay? Now, when I was reading this, at this point I was sort of bleary-eyed and kind of being like, what are they going into now? But don't fear, okay? These reading lists at the end, and thank you for still watching this if you're still watching this, these are reading lists. These can be used with your graduate students, with your undergraduate students, with making, with assigning readings and stuff like this. So they're broken up in nicely kind of packaged topics. This is third world decolonializations, a whole bunch of sources there. Okay, use them in your classes. We also have abolition of slavery, a number of sources there. We have pedagogies. And this section, and this is page number 30, this section of pedagogies is probably more relevant to university professors and teachers, a different source. Pedagogy goes on, and I will go to the conclusion. And it concludes, and it basically says that fake decolonialization is more to appease settlers. It's a filler that wastes time. It's a filler that causes a lot of harm. And it's a filler that needs to be stopped. So in order to actually decolonialize, we really need to take seriously the idea of ownership. We really do need to take seriously the idea of land, of sovereignty, and it is not just going to a couple of meetings and kind of reading a couple of papers and throwing around a few words around, some sort of some sort of like policy and university policy. If decolonialization takes place, shit hits the fan, and shit goes sideways, and heads roll, and crap goes down. And so I think the main kind of takeaway for this is that I think for decolonialization, I think it's important for us to sort of roll up our sleeves and to get ready for a relatively long haul, because it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be simple. And to be honest, if it's done properly, any institution that goes through this is never really ever going to be the same. Thanks.